light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved ever be. Welcome. I'm Sister Who. Today I wanted to offer a few thoughts and reflections on relationships, specifically in terms of how some people I meet seem to view relationships as egalitarian and some as hierarchical. And both are present within the world at large. I suppose the most common example of hierarchical relationships that might come to a lot of people's minds would be the caste system in India, of where there were people who were considered of less value than certain others. But there are echoes or suggestions of this within many societies around the world. In our present times, it often seems to be equated to monetary worth. In certain past times, it might be a question of whether you were the peasant class or the aristocracy or a member of the royalty. In having these hierarchical relationships, however, it's always a bit problematic. There may be a certain efficiency to it from a certain perspective, but it's always a bit problematic because life has this peculiar way of putting the most wonderful gifts in the most unlikely places. There is a movie that brings out the point in a comedic sort of way called Ever After, in which a character representing Leonardo da Vinci appears, supposedly Leonardo da Vinci, but there are a number of anomalies and anachronisms to the movie that, if you know your history, make it amusing to see how the producers took creative license in their depiction of the movie. The Mona Lisa, for example, was not painted on canvas, it was painted on wood, so it could never have been rolled up like it was in that movie. But there's a scene in which the young woman who is supposed to have been the original, real Cinderella confides to Leonardo da Vinci that the prince loves her, she loves the prince, but he is royalty and I'm a peasant, and I'm a commoner. And Leonardo da Vinci responds, "And I'm the bastard son of a peasant. What has that to do with anything?" The basic point that is brought out through the movie and through this ancient fairy tale of Cinderella is that love knows no bounds. Love doesn't care who is rich and who is poor, what race, what religion. Love happens. Even in Shakespeare's work, Romeo and Juliet, the basic problem of the story is describing Romeo and Juliet as star-crossed lovers, that if our fates are written in the stars, astrologically, then these two young people were essentially cursed from birth because they were to fall in love with each other, a love that refused to be denied or censored or repressed or put aside. And in the end, it cost them their lives because they came from rival houses or rival families that could not tolerate each other, and kind of a medieval age feud, I suppose you might say. In more modern times, there's the folklore of the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys in the Appalachian Mountains, and again, it's the same sort of thing of who you are allowed to love, who you are allowed to fall in love with, who you're allowed to marry. For a very long time, it was not legally prohibited, but in practice prohibited, I guess, to marry outside of one's religion. It would have been a very radical thing in certain times for a Catholic to marry a Lutheran, or for a Baptist to marry a Catholic, or for any Protestant or Catholic to marry a Jew. But in actual practice, people meet, individuals come to know each other, and often through very unusual sets of circumstances fall in love, to where they are so drawn to the other person and they value that person's happiness above all else, that if that in order for them to be fulfilled and happy and at peace in their lives in any sense of the word, they have to be with this person. And the romanticized notions that humanity has of love and loving relationships is wonderful and inspiring in a sense, but a lot of our literature in all different countries even centers around people who come from different classes that are regarded hierarchically as far as who is better than the other. And of course it depends on perspective also. In Romeo and Juliet, if you asked either of the families or the houses, the Capulets or the Montagues, who is better, of course they would each say that our house is better than theirs. And objectively one could say better in what sense, but it's really kind of beside the point, because ultimately what matters in that story is not who is better than whom, but love. And I suggest that love has a much better chance of blessing human experience and human individuals and even human communities if we can shift from the hierarchical notions to something that is more egalitarian. In a societal sense, there may be a functional hierarchy that is necessary. Someone has to be the supervisor for a larger number of workers. It doesn't mean that the supervisor is better than the workers. It means that there is a certain organization for efficiency, that in order to get the job done, certain people have to be responsible for certain decisions, and consequently they may need to spend time doing research in order to make the best and wisest decision, rather than being the one who is doing the actual work. So on a farm, for example, there may be a large number of people who are out simply harvesting the crops. There is someone else who has to study or read books or go to school or whatever's necessary to figure out which crop would be best for this field and what the weather reports are and whether this is going to be a year of plenty or a year of drought, and what are the historical records for that particular field, whether it is time for that field to be left fallow for a year and not planted or tilled so that the land can rest, or whether it is time to begin a new cycle. As popular as the crop corn is across much of the farming country where I grew up, everyone there also understands that corn depletes the soil. It takes nutrients out, and if you farm a field too many years in succession, planting and harvesting corn, it will so ravage the soil nutritionally that it will be difficult for anything to grow there. And so that's where farmers talk about rotating crops, that one year in this particular field, one year it's corn, one year it's soybeans, one year it's something else, one year it's left fallow, just allowed to go to weeds and grass and whatever. The point being that it's finding an egalitarian sort of symbiosis, that one thing isn't regarded as better or worse than another, but that there is an organization to the cycles, and that just as there is someone who has to harvest it, there's someone who has to do the homework of checking the records and finding out what was planted there last year and what needs to be planted there next year, and where we are in the cycle, and do we have the machinery and the people and the equipment and everything necessary to get the harvest done, and to get the planting done, and to get all the cultivating in between done. And so it's not that the supervisor is better than the workers, but simply that they have different jobs to do. In the world of theater, the common saying is that there are no small parts, only small players. Even the roles that have the most lines and consequently the most memorization work that has to be done, those roles are completely dependent upon each and every prop and cue and supporting line being spoken at the right time. If someone doesn't make an entrance at the right time, if a prop isn't where it's supposed to be, you may be the star of the show, but you're going to look very foolish on stage because you won't be able to do your lines with any believability. There was one community theater play I was in once, and in which I'm saying this particular line, and I'm supposed to be interrupted by someone coming in from off stage. And the person totally missed his cue and wasn't appearing and wasn't appearing and wasn't appearing, and I was kind of stumbling and stumbling and stumbling, and finally one of the other characters who knew what was supposed to happen leaned over and looked off stage and said, "Owen, is that you?" And at that point, of course, he comes stumbling onto stage like, oops, and we went on with the play. But it was a wonderful cover, but it was the only way to somehow give this guy a metaphorical kick in the pants to tell him to hurry up and get on stage, because the whole play was falling flat. And someone could say, well, I'm the star of the show and you made me look bad, shame on you, and I'm not sure really what that accomplishes. The point was we found a way to keep the play going. It was the play as a whole that mattered. And when it comes to farming, it's the harvest as a whole that matters. It's the fact that sufficient food is harvested to keep humanity going, that we're not going to have a year of famine where people are literally starving to death. And we can argue about the minutiae along the way, and I suppose it's good to discuss it, but blaming is a waste of time. We need to look at the systems we have in place and find out whether they're effectively functioning. One of the things that was coming into vogue much more as I was growing up was the whole notion of contour plowing, that instead of plowing up and down the hill, you would go around the hill, so that when it rained, the water would go over the plowed rows and be slowed on its way down the hill so that it wouldn't erode. If the farmer plowed straight up and down the hill, it essentially made a channel, and so much water would run down that it would literally form a gully right in the side of the hill, and so much good farmland would be washed away. But again, it's not about who's better or who's worse. It's about everybody being collaborative fingers on a single hand. That you have the one who studies the effect of erosion, the one who teaches the methods of contour plowing, the farmer who does it, the people who harvest it. Nobody's any better or worse than anyone else, because if you take any one of those people out of the equation, the whole project, the whole goal falls flat and sinks into failure. The problem, I guess, is that because these systems are so entrenched in humanity, that there are places around the world that still have royalty and that still have aristocracy and still have working class people, that they erroneously believe themselves to be better or worse than another. There was a song, I believe it was by Fred Small, but it was about a situation in Australia, and I haven't listened to the song in a long time, but it's a fascinating story of this young lady, or this young girl growing up in Australia, and her mother gets bitten by a snake, and she has to run to town for the doctor, the white doctor, and she has to run past the Aborigines camp. The Aborigines being very dark-skinned people who, according to the song, had no animosity toward the white settlers, I guess, the white people from Europe who had moved in and created farms and so forth in Australia. The young girl basically runs to the doctor and comes back with the doctor, but it's been too long. They get there too late, and the mother dies from the snake bite. And at the funeral, this Aboriginal woman shows up who saw her go running by and on that night when her mother died, and she said, "And why didn't you come to us? Because we had all sorts of things that we could have used that would have saved your mother's life." But because there was a hierarchical perspective that was defined in this case according to race, the young girl did not ask for help from those who were immediately available. She ran to someone who was much further away, and it resulted in disaster and somebody dying. When a rich person will not accept or ask for help from a poor person, they both lose. Because by allowing that symbiotic kind of relationship, they may find that they can be friends, that they can help each other, that there may be, it's not that the rich person will make sure the poor person is never poor again. I'm going to fix everything. I'm going to write that's a little over the top. It's kind of like a class I was in graduate school, in which the substitute or the adjunct teacher of the class, someone who really was not a seasoned professor, was attempting to teach about wealth distribution. And at one point, I was getting tired of all the ignorant statements she was making. And I don't mean to be snobbish or anything, but it was really kind of ignorant the way she was portraying things as these hostile categories. And I said, well, finally I got a word in edgewise, and I said, so you have the rich and the poor, and we could take all the money from the rich and give it to the poor, but would that solve everything? Well, no, not actually, because it's a little more complicated than that. There are all sorts of skills that have to accompany the possession of wealth, such that when our own time, people may win a lottery. Suddenly they have all this money, but they have no money management skills, and they have to learn quickly how to manage this incomprehensible sum of money, or they wind up losing it very quickly. Which kind of comes back to that basic question of how do we do the most good with this? Well, it takes a certain experience, a certain knowledge, and a certain available resource. The one who doesn't have the resource may have the knowledge and not be able to do anything with it. The one who has the knowledge but doesn't have the resource again is stymied, and it's only by collaborating and putting the two together that we begin to see miraculous and wonderful things happen. But to come together, there needs to be a sort of egalitarian dynamic to it. If it's hierarchical and it becomes, well, for lack of a better description, I guess it becomes an ego-driven issue that the person who thinks they are greater now has to stoop to asking help from the person they believe to be lesser, when if they had regarded each other as equal but different in the first place, it would simply be, well, I need this, oh, I have some of that. Well, I need this, well, I have some of that. And it becomes people taking care of people. But that's what happens when you move toward an egalitarian sort of situation. At the time we're recording this show, and I guess for the foreseeable future, I often hear about how wonderfully balanced and integrated a society is in Scandinavia, where there's a much more equal wealth distribution. They do have a royal family, but the royal family are not living in luxury from everything I've heard. They're in comparison to other royal families around the world, they're living very modestly, and they're not pretentious about having wealth or being royalty. And in that sense, I would suspect that it makes them easier to respect them as leaders also, that they are not simply making themselves better than everybody else, but they are truly serving the best interests of their country. And ultimately, government is more about public service than it is about being better or worse or being hierarchical. If you consider someone to be less than yourself, it is likely to make it difficult to ask them for help, because it's as if you're stooping to a lower level. If you're already on the same level in the first place, in an egalitarian sort of relationship, that we have different resources, we have different living situations, but a person is a person is a person is a person. I've been saying that for over 20 years. And the person who has been blessed with greater wealth, from a monetary perspective, it seems once again to recommend this kind of self-sabotaging hierarchy. I have more money, so I get to say more. What happens? Well, if I don't have the knowledge, I may not be able to say what happens with any significant amount of wisdom. It may be a poor person with wisdom who helps me make the best use of my wealth or resources. But I have to be open to it in an egalitarian sort of way, instead of feeling like I am somehow demeaning myself by accepting help from this other person. And in a similar sort of way, the person who doesn't have resources and may feel impoverished and trying to bolster a weak ego that because I don't have money I'm not a worthy special person, and I have to prove that I'm good enough, and so the one thing I can't do is confess weakness or show that I need anything from you. I can do it all by myself. I don't need anybody's help. Everybody needs somebody's help at some point, and each and every person on this planet is at the center of a constellation of interdependent relationships. This notion that I don't need anybody is so ridiculously false, it really legitimately should be laughed at every time it's heard. We all need each other. The question is finding ways and dynamics by which we can love and respect each other that don't put each other down and don't interpret or presume who is better or worse than anybody else. The poor person who asks for help from the rich person is not doing so to take advantage of them. They're doing it because they want the world to work. And for the world to work, the rich and the poor, everybody has to have some place to be. Everybody has to have food to eat and a house to live in. Everyone has to have some way of learning whatever it is they need to know to address the next challenge that they will face. The rich person needs the poor person because if all the poor people were removed from the planet and there was nothing left but the rich people, no rich person I've ever met knows how to fix a robot or a computer or anything else in their house, really. I've had to fix up a number of my own houses over recent years, but a lot of times I would be doing handyman work for other people who were financially better off than I was, but mostly because they didn't have the knowledge to know how to fix a pipe or change an outlet or make a light fixture work again. It's all, the further I go in life, the more I see again and again and again. It's about symbiotic relationships, each part helping each other part, and it's not about who's better or worse. When I was growing up during my teenage years, I was reminded in a really obnoxious way that my parents lived under this antiquated notion that parents were supposed to be superior or hierarchically better, smarter, wiser, whatever, than their children. And so when I had a part-time job working for a farmer who raised pigs, I didn't have a vehicle at the time, and so I borrowed my father's old pickup truck to go to and from the farm outside of town where I would do the work each day. Well, that all was all well and good until the time, because of my one auto mechanics course in high school, I correctly diagnosed a failing water pump. Well, because I knew what was wrong with his truck and he didn't, my father never let me borrow the truck again, because somehow he felt like he wasn't living up to this hierarchical place that he had envisioned for himself. And of course, I wasn't looking at it as a put down, and I wasn't looking at it as a way to put myself up. I was simply addressing the fact that the water pump was failing. I had no emotional need to be better than anybody else. I simply recognized that a problem existed and I knew how to fix it. And because of the hierarchical societal structures, I essentially didn't have permission to know what I knew. And to prevent that horrible circumstance from ever happening again, I was never allowed to borrow the truck again from that point on. It's self-sabotaging. Everywhere I've looked, I understand the hierarchical organization of a supervisor and workers, but it's not about superior and inferior, it's about different roles. All the roles have to be filled or the job can't get done. there has to be someone who does everything from the most odious, mundane cleaning the toilets all the way up to the person who knows how to fix a computer when it crashes and nobody can get it to work again. And we all need each other. And there's a lot of amazing things that can happen when we make a point of not looking down on someone, but simply being there with them and figuring out how we can be complementary. In any case, thank you for watching. I hope I've shared some things in the last half hour that are helpful to you. Blessings.